We treat intelligence like it's some kind of miracle, an unseen force that's powerful enough to shape an entire life from behind the scenes. We assume that if you're intelligent enough, the world should bend more easily in your favor. You should be able to resolve problems faster, make better choices much easier, and you should have your entire life figured out before the first time any adult even gets the chance to ask, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" But this belief that intelligence is some form of protection from the hardships of life only exists because of survivor's guilt. We hear from the most successful, intelligent people and assume that that's the case for everyone, when in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. When we actually look at the neuroscience and psychology of highly intelligent people, we discover that, for the most part, it doesn't feel like protection at all, but actually overexposure. Instead of a world that's simplified, they're forced to live in a world that's hyper-fragmented and completely unstable. And all of this could lead to a pretty grim reality if left unchecked. This is the depressing psychology of people with extremely high intelligence. Part 1. The Cognitive Engine. The first mistake is to imagine a high level of intelligence as simply an upgrade, a faster version of the same operating system, a more efficient processing, quicker recall, better performance across familiar tasks. It isn't. The highly intelligent mind doesn't just process information more quickly, it processes it differently. The structure of thought and, in turn, behavior itself begins to shift. The mind stops acting like a tool and starts behaving like an engine that never turns off. Psychologists describe this as a need for cognition. However, I have a slight issue with the way the phrase is worded because need for cognition suggests that the person simply enjoys thinking more than others, when in reality it's much closer to a compulsion. A conversation isn't finished when the other person stops talking. The mind then takes that conversation and reconstructs it later, examining it from multiple angles, stripping it down into its components of tone, implication, and intent, all that semiotic goop. Every fragment of experience is replayed not for the memory's sake, but for analysis. And the consequence of this is a mind that never settles. You don't get any closure or any sort of proper conclusion. You are constantly thinking about the many branches of possibilities, the multiple interpretations of the same event, all of which can completely destabilize your own perception of reality. This process gets even worse when the mind begins to simulate the future. Neuroscience refers to this as prospective cognition, but again, I feel like the term hides the intensity of what is actually happening. The mind isn't simply predicting outcomes, it is constructing detailed internal simulations of them. Before a decision is made, multiple versions of the future are already being played out in the mind. Different actions, different reactions, different consequences. And hey, at first, this feels like a huge strategic advantage. It allows for foresight, planning, anticipation of risks before they even materialize. But within this advantage is a hidden flaw. Because the more futures the mind can generate, the harder it becomes to commit to a single one. It's the classic illusion of choice. When presented with way too many options, it becomes a lot more difficult to just pick one and stick to it. That's why you often see highly intelligent people that just cannot decide what they want to do with their life. Every waking moment, they can see all of the different possibilities of who they could become, and it just becomes so difficult to pick just one. And this actively works against them in a world that rewards specialization over generalization. Beyond the external consequences, you also get some internal issues too. Metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking, becomes a constant background process. So now you're not only generating thoughts, but you're also evaluating those same thoughts in real time. The mind splits into layers. One part produces ideas, another part observes them, and a third critiques. Just like prospective cognition, this feels like a great thing at first. It's a way to improve your accuracy and avoid errors, after all. But upon close inspection, when every thought is immediately subject to critique, your confidence completely shatters. Just like a child stops trying if you constantly tell them that they're not good enough, the part of your brain responsible for generating new ideas slowly dies out when it's constantly criticized. Only that this time, you're also the one doing the critiquing. This internal complexity is amplified by a structural difference in how the brain organizes attention. In most people, focused attention and spontaneous thought operate in opposition. When the mind concentrates, you stop daydreaming. When it wanders, structured reasoning quiets down. This alternation creates a very stable, comfortable rhythm. But in highly intelligent individuals, this boundary is weakened. The systems responsible for focused control and those responsible for abstract association begin to operate simultaneously. The result is not just more thought, but a different kind of thought entirely. While focusing on a specific task, the mind continues generating connections in the background. Ideas from unrelated domains begin to link together. Patterns emerge across contexts that were never meant to intersect. A simple problem becomes connected to a broader conceptual network. The individual is no longer solving the task in isolation. They are situating that task within a much larger and more complicated system. By this point, the pattern is clear. The highly intelligent mind is not simply more capable, it is more active, more recursive, more connected, and way more demanding. And this is only the cognitive layer. The system has not yet reached emotion. It hasn't reached sensation. It hasn't reached over to other people. But there is a more immediate problem. A mind like this doesn't naturally come to rest. It doesn't slow down when the task ends. And we've built an environment that makes all of this worse. We have endless input thanks to things like infinite scrolling, feeding you with constant stimulation. You finish one thought, and before that thought even resolves, something else replaces it. I've started noticing it in very specific moments. Late at night, when I tell myself, I'm just going to check something quickly, and suddenly an hour has passed. Or in between tasks, when there's a small gap of silence, instead of just letting myself stay quiet, I reach for my phone without thinking, and it's not because I need something, but because I've forgotten how to pause, and that is the real problem. It's not the phone itself, it's the reflex. So I started intentionally doing something else. Instead of filling those gaps automatically, I began replacing them deliberately. I would open Headspace, even if I had just a few minutes. I went through their guided breathwork collection that has all these breathing techniques that help you relax your mind and body. I've really been enjoying box breathing as it helps to calm me down in just 5 minutes. And the effect was immediate. It wasn't dramatic or anything, but I started to feel significantly more calm and more grounded in the moment.
Breathing out through the mouth for 1, 2, 3, 4.
My mind stopped jumping between ideas and could finally settle down. And now when I catch myself scrolling like that, that's my cue to open up Headspace and reset. What surprised me is how little time it actually takes. 5 minutes is enough to feel the difference between reacting automatically and choosing what you engage with. And this isn't just subjective. Headspace has been studied extensively. Just 5 minutes of headspace a day has been proven to reduce stress, and even a few days of use can improve focus. Over time, many people find it also supports sleep and helps to manage anxiety. If you've been feeling that same kind of mental overload, where your attention feels scattered and your thoughts never fully rest, you can try Headspace for free for 60 days using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. That's 2 months of unlimited access. For how good it is, this is honestly a no-brainer. It's not about disconnecting from everything. It's about choosing what you let your mind connect to. And once you do that, even briefly, you realize that your mind's not weak. It just needs some time to rest. Part 2. The emotional and sensory volume. If intelligence were only cognitive, its burden would remain contained. The problem would be structural, but manageable. A matter of thought patterns, decision-making, and internal complexity, something that could, at least in principle, be regulated. But of course, it does not stop there. Because the same system that processes reality more deeply also feels it more intensely. The first distortion appears in empathy. Empathy is usually understood as a moral quality, the ability to care about others, to recognize their emotional states, and to respond appropriately. But in highly intelligent individuals, empathy becomes less a choice and more of a perceptual condition, a mandatory operational parameter. It operates automatically. Signals that others barely register become almost impossible to ignore. Subtle shifts in tone, micro-expressions, pauses that carry meaning, contradictions between what has been said and what is implied. The mind constructs internal models of other people with the same precision it applies to abstract problems. It tracks emotional states, predicts reactions, infers hidden motives, and this creates an unusual advantage. And, if you've been paying any attention, it also creates quite a burden. Because perception doesn't just stop at recognition. The emotional state of another person doesn't remain external. It becomes internalized. The individual doesn't only understand what others feel, they also experience it, often involuntarily. This phrase, which I absolutely adore, is called emotional contagion. Pull that one out at a party. And it transforms empathy from a strength into a massive liability. The world becomes saturated with signals that just cannot be turned off. Imagine having the ability to read everyone's mind in every room you could walk into. How difficult would that experience be? You enter into a room of 100 people and you can hear everything from everyone's minds all at once. It's a terrifying concept. So what do you do with that information overload? Well, you withdraw. You seek solitude out of necessity. It's a way of reducing input to a level that you can better manage without burning yourself out. But that withdrawal is frequently misinterpreted by others. It's seen as an antisocial behavior, as detachment or worse, disinterest. But I should clarify, it is none of these. It's the only way you know how to recover mentally and emotionally. This dual amplification of both emotion and imagination leads to a rather unique kind of psychological pressure, where you're capable of experiencing both good and bad extremes simultaneously. You can experience deep empathy along with extraordinary emotional fatigue, creative insight and anticipatory anxiety, sensory richness and sensory overload. Sometimes this can produce extraordinary depth in individuals, a capacity to feel, to understand and create in ways that are inaccessible to others. And this is the external part most people see when they talk about highly intelligent people. They see capability, creativity, and incredible insights. What they don't see, however, is the internal cost of sustaining that capacity, the continuous input, the emotional absorption, the inability to filter any of this, the persistent internal activity, the lack of mental quietness and clarity. The more I looked into the neuroscience behind all of this, the more interesting questions began to pop up in my own mind. Like, what happens when the mind not only detects patterns in reality, but also absorbs the emotional and sensory weight of those patterns in real time? The answer isn't immediately visible when you're on your own. But once you are in the middle of a social environment, it becomes painfully clear. Because other people are not neutral stimuli, they are very complex and unpredictable systems all of their own. And this is where the really big problems start to set in. Part 3. The social burden and isolation. Up to this point, the system has remained internal. A cognitive engine that does not shut down, an emotional field that can't be filtered, a sensory system that absorbs more than it can comfortably process. These pressures are significant, yes, but the saving grace is at least they're still contained inside that person. But, unfortunately, none of us exist in a vacuum. And when the structure of one mind differs too sharply from the structure of the surrounding group, something subtle begins to fracture. The first fracture appears as a communication gap. Most social interaction operates on a compression algorithm. Ideas are simplified, language is streamlined. Complexity is reduced to maintain speed and cohesion in the conversation. And these conversations move quickly because they relied on shared and unspoken assumptions and incomplete explanations. Precision is sacrificed for flow and speed, and for the most part, that's a good thing. For the highly intelligent mind, however, this compression feels unnatural. Beneath every simplified statement, the omitted layers remain visible. Every generalization reveals its exceptions. Every conclusion reveals the assumptions. The individual hears not only what's said, but everything that has been left unsaid. This creates a subtle but persistent friction. Because the conversation being experienced internally isn't the same as the conversation being spoken externally. The individual is operating at a different level. And at first, sure, this all seems like a very minor inconvenience. It's just a slight misalignment in conversational styles. Fine, who cares? But when this is nearly every single conversation with almost everyone, you can start to see how exhausting it gets. You feel like every conversation is a performance rather than a true exchange of ideas and opinions. So, you start to mask. You're forced to compress your own thinking to match the environment, to maintain coherence within the group and avoid creating any unnecessary friction. And hey, you know what? The strategy works. But it comes with a cost. Because over time, the gap between internal experience and external expression begins to widen. You're no longer communicating what you actually think, but only a representation of what you think people can understand. And with that comes a specific kind of isolation. Not physical isolation, but a mental one, where you're surrounded by others, maybe even participating in shared activities, but your core thoughts and opinions remain unseen. In a way, it feels like you're giving up a part of yourself so you can properly function within the group. And that's just, well, sad. Beyond that, there's also the unfortunate reality that a lot of social systems rely on selective attention. You need to be able to overlook certain contradictions in order to preserve certain relationships, to tolerate certain inconsistencies because confronting them could destabilize the whole system. But the highly intelligent mind struggles to perform this filtering. It sees too much. And once something has been seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This produces what can only be described as the curse of awareness. Over time, you begin to perceive a persistent gap between surface-level reality and its underlying structures. Social norms appear less like truths and more like agreements. Institutions appear less like stable systems and more like negotiated constructs. Behavior appears less consistent and more context-dependent. The world doesn't become meaningless, but everything becomes conditional. And conditional systems are difficult to trust. This shift in perception introduces a new kind of tension because while the individual sees through certain structures, they are still required to participate within them. They must operate within systems that they no longer fully believe in. They have to follow rules that appear arbitrary, engage in interactions that feel partially constructed. The system doesn't allow for complete disengagement, and so the individual remains inside of it, aware of its limitations, and unable to fully reconcile with them. Then you have the fact that if you're intelligent and you're not shy to express it, some people can feel threatened by that. Psychologically, this can be understood as a form of the mirror effect. When people experience social or intellectual threat, the amygdala activates. The same system responsible for detecting danger begins to respond to perceived cognitive imbalances. The reaction is physiological in nature. The individual isn't rejected because they lack value. They are resisted because they introduce instability to the shared social ecosystem. And this dynamic has a historical precedent. Throughout history, individuals who pursued truth beyond the limits of social comfort have often been marginalized. Not because they were incorrect, but because they were inconvenient for the status quo. Socrates was executed for daring to question the whims of the state. Galileo was punished for contradicting the teachings of the church. Turing was persecuted for being too different. The pattern is consistent. Society doesn't resist intelligence itself. It resists when intelligence reveals an error in its current system. This distinction, in my opinion, is critical because it reframes the source of this isolation. The individual isn't isolated because they're incapable of connection. They're isolated because the conditions required for genuine connection are rare to come across, and they require depth, precision, tolerance for complexity, willingness to engage beyond simplified models. These conditions exist, but they're not common. And so the individual remains in a state of partial integration, connected but not fully understood, engaged but not fully expressive, present but not fully seen. At this point, the problem has expanded beyond cognition and perception. It's now become structural, because the system is operating across 3 layers simultaneously: continuous internal processing, amplified emotional and sensory input, and misaligned social interaction. And each of these layers introduces their own pressures, but together they produce something more complex. A form of internal tension that cannot be resolved through adjustment alone, because the problem is no longer internal. It's embedded in the way the system operates. And this is where the final layer begins to emerge, not as a new category, but as a convergence point, where cognition, emotion, and social experiences intersect and begin to turn inward. This is where intelligence stops being a trait and becomes a condition that shapes how existence itself is interpreted. This is where it all becomes existential. Part 4: The Existential Weights and Paradoxes. The first sign of this shift appears in decision-making. From the outside, intelligence is expected to produce decisiveness, the ability to analyze options, identify the optimal path, and act with confidence. The assumption is that more information leads to better choices. But this assumes that information converges to a single point. In the highly intelligent mind, it does not. Because every decision isn't just evaluated once, it's expanded into a network of possible outcomes. Each choice generates multiple trajectories, each trajectory branches into further consequences. The system isn't seeing one future, it sees many. And each one carries its own risks, trade-offs, and uncertainties. This creates a condition known as analysis paralysis. But I think that term is misleading. It suggests hesitation due to weakness, and this isn't the case at all. It's not weakness we're talking about. The system isn't failing to decide. It's overwhelmed by the number of decisions it can see simultaneously. Actions require reduction. It requires collapsing all of these possibilities into a single path. But the mind resists that collapse because it remains aware of everything that is being excluded in this process. To choose one is to ignore the alternative, and the highly intelligent mind isn't built to ignore things. This creates a second tension between imagination and reality. The same capacity that allows the individual to simulate multiple futures also allows them to construct ideal ones. These aren't vague aspirations, but they are detailed internal models of how something could be executed perfectly, whether it's a project, a career, or even a life path. The mind can see the optimal version with clarity, but reality doesn't operate at that level of precision. Execution always introduces noise and constraints and imperfection. Outcomes diverge from your intention, and the result rarely matches your internal model. And when the comparison is made, the difference isn't perceived as an acceptable variation. It's perceived as outright failure. This is called maladaptive perfectionism. The inability to tolerate any deviation from an internally constructed ideal. You're not measuring yourself against others. You're measuring yourself against an idealized, perfect erosion of reality that is impossible to replicate in the real world. And the consequence of this, as you can imagine, is chronic dissatisfaction. Over time, this dissatisfaction accumulates into cognitive exhaustion, or, as it's more commonly referred to, burnout. This internal pressure is compounded by a third paradox: the relationship between intelligence and self-perception. There's a widely observed phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Individuals with low ability tend to overestimate their competence, while individuals with high ability tend to underestimate theirs. The explanation is straightforward. The more you know, the more aware you become of what you don't know. But in the highly intelligent mind, this awareness doesn't just remain abstract, it becomes continuous. Every domain reveals its own depth. Every answer reveals further questions. The boundary of knowledge expands faster than the content within it. The individual isn't simply aware of gaps in their understanding, they are surrounded by them. This produces intellectual humility, which is a good thing. But it also produces structural self-doubt. You never believe you're correct, and you constantly assume your information is incomplete, and as such, every conclusion is provisional. Every belief then is subject to revision, and confidence is replaced by an ongoing verification process. And these three pressures, analysis saturation, perfectionism, and structural doubt, begin to then converge. The individual is highly capable but increasingly hesitant, highly insightful but increasingly dissatisfied, highly aware but increasingly uncertain. This destabilization reaches its most profound form when it turns towards existential questions. Because the highly intelligent mind does not remain confined to practical problems. It extends naturally into the realm of abstraction. Questions of meaning, purpose, mortality, and existence are constantly turned over and perused. And when they are pursued with the same level of intensity applied elsewhere, they don't resolve into comforting answers, they expand into ever more unsettling thoughts. Consider the concept of meaning. For most individuals, meaning is constructed through participation, and these are relationships, goals, routines. It's experienced rather than analyzed or dissected. Its structure is implicit and not examined in any great detail. But the highly intelligent mind interrogates it. What is meaning structurally? Is it inherent, or have we just constructed it? If it's constructed, by what mechanism did we construct it? If it's dependent on perception, does it persist independently of it? If meaning can be created, could it also be invalidated? These questions don't remain theoretical, they can start to affect a person's lived experience. Because once meaning is understood as contingent, it loses its automatic authority. Actions no longer feel inherently justified. Goals no longer feel self-evident. The individual becomes aware that the frameworks used to define purpose are themselves constructed. A similar process occurs with mortality. The awareness of death is universal, but for most people it remains abstract, distant, and manageable. It's acknowledged, yeah, but not continuously integrated into perception. For the highly intelligent mind, the inevitability of death is not a distant idea. It is a constant boundary condition. Every action is framed within it. Every plan exists within a finite horizon. The individual is not simply aware that life ends, they are aware of how that ending shapes everything before it. This awareness produces a certain difficult weight that humans are simply not evolved to carry. And as a result, over time, these abstract pressures accumulate into what can be described as existential depression. And not depression in the clinical sense of dysfunction, but in the structural sense of disillusionment. The individual begins to perceive a gap between the scale of the questions that they're confronting and the scale of the activities they are expected to perform from day to day. Because daily life continues. Tasks have to be completed. You have to brush your teeth. Responsibilities must be fulfilled, systems navigated. But these activities begin to feel disconnected from the underlying questions that occupy the mind. The individual is operating on two levels simultaneously, one practical and one existential, and that distance between them grows. This creates a final paradox. The system that produces the deepest understanding of reality also produces the greatest difficulty in participating within it. The structures that give life coherence, meaning, purpose, identity are seen as constructs rather than foundations. They still function, oh sure, but they don't feel absolute. And functioning without absolutes requires constant reconstruction, which creates even more mental strain. At this point, the transformation is complete. Intelligence is no longer a trait that improves performance within the system. It is a condition that changes how the system itself is perceived. And all of this leads to a final question. If intelligence removes the illusions that make life feel stable, what remains then? What replaces certainty when certainty dissolves? What replaces inherited meaning when meaning becomes visible as a construction? What does the system do when it can no longer rely on the assumptions that once supported it? Well, I have to be honest, we don't have an answer to these questions. All you can do is find a way to adapt, to live within a world that no longer feels complete. Because the system cannot return to its previous state, you just have to learn to operate within it. Part 5. Navigating the Gift. The first adaptation requires a reversal of how effort itself is managed. Most people organize their lives around time. Hours are allocated to different activities using schedules, and productivity is measured by how much time each of these activities take and what you can accomplish within them. The assumption is that consistency produces results, that showing up repeatedly and predictably is sufficient. But this model doesn't map cleanly onto a system that operates on intensity rather than continuity. The highly intelligent mind doesn't produce output in a linear fashion. It doesn't engage evenly across all tasks. It activates selectively in response to complexity, novelty, and pressure. There are periods of apparent inactivity followed by periods of extreme focus and disproportionate output. From the outside, this appears inconsistent. From the inside, it's just efficient. The mistake is trying to force a version of consistency into a system that won't support it. Instead of trying to manage time, manage energy. Identify the conditions under which your mind activates and operates at full capacity. Protect those conditions and then structure your environment to allow deep engagement when it naturally comes to you, rather than forcing yourself to have all these shallow thoughts just to fill the time. This is known to a lot of people as getting into a flow state, the moment where work stops feeling like work and everything just, it clicks. In the flow state, multiple systems that are usually in tension begin to align. Attention narrows, but not too rigidly. It becomes precise without becoming brittle. The background noise of unrelated thoughts recedes because the mind is synchronized around a single trajectory. The recursive loops that normally fragment attention collapse into forward motion. But this state isn't randomly accessible. It can only happen when the difficulty of the task is precisely matched to the capability of the mind. If it's too simple, the mind disengages. Too complex, and it fragments. Flow exists at that perfect threshold, the point where the task is demanding enough to require full attention, but easy enough to allow progress. And it is a very, very narrow window. And more importantly, you cannot force it. This is where the earlier mistake becomes clear. Trying to produce flow through discipline alone is ineffective because discipline operates on time, not on conditions. It assumes that sustained effort will eventually produce engagement. But for a system that requires alignment, effort without the right conditions produces resistance, not immersion. You can sit at a desk for hours and never enter flow, but by designing the right systems, you might even be able to enter it on command, which is very neat. One of those systems is embracing solitude. This leads to a second, more difficult adjustment, the re-evaluation of solitude. In most social frameworks, solitude is often framed as a deficit rather than a necessity. But for a mind that is continuously processing, continuously absorbing and evaluating, solitude can serve a different function. It's not simply being antisocial, it is a necessary decompression that the brain needs to keep functioning optimally. Without these periods of reduced input, the system accumulates noise, things like emotional residue, unprocessed sensory data, unending cognitive loops. Solitude stops this pattern and creates a space for the mind to just relax and rejuvenate. By thinking of solitude through this new lens, you stop thinking of your own need as a dysfunction, and you start embracing a healthy coping mechanism for your own mind. But, as always, there is a need for balance. Taking regular moments of solitude doesn't mean that you can completely cut people out of your life and go live as a hermit in the woods. Far from it. In fact, this leads us perfectly to the third adaptation to help cope with your mind, and that's actually to avoid isolation. Yep, just follow me on this. I just talked about solitude, but regulated solitude is totally different from prolonged periods of isolation. Solitude is a healthy way to recharge. The other way is a fast way to lose your mind from loneliness. And while yes, I am talking about physical isolation, I'm talking about more than that. I think the more pressing issue is mental isolation. That feeling that no one can understand you, the gap between the internal complexity of your mind and what you're able to express to those around you. And I'll be honest, the sad truth is that this gap can't be eliminated entirely, but it can be reduced a lot by changing your environment. Understanding that you don't need to be friends with everyone. You just need a few people who are operating at a compatible level of depth, people who are capable of engaging with the complexity that you have to share without you needing to collapse it for mass consumption. These connections are wonderful, and they are, sadly, rare. But they are not non-existent. They are out there, and when they do happen, they breathe such a breath of fresh air into your life that everything starts to feel better. You stop feeling the need to mask your true thoughts. You stop feeling the need to compress yourself. You can express your true self without reduction. And this produces something that had previously been unstable: resonance. Resonance doesn't eliminate the underlying complexity. It doesn't resolve the recursive thinking, the emotional intensity, the structural doubt, but it redistributes the weight and makes it a lot easier for you to carry. The idea of intelligence as a simple advantage has been dismantled. The model of ease has been replaced by a model of exposure. The assumption of clarity has been replaced by a recognition of complexity. It's a lot more difficult to hear, sure, but it's also more accurate. And accuracy carries a cost. It removes illusions before they're incomplete. They compress reality into forms that are easier to navigate. They provide stability by reducing complexity. They allow the system to function without confronting every single contradiction. But intelligence expands those contradictions by making the invisible structures visible. This is the final inversion. The problem isn't that intelligence isolates you from reality. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The problem is that it brings you much closer to it. The world that feels stable to others feels conditional to you. And within that condition, a choice emerges for you. Not a choice about whether you're intelligent or not, that's fixed, but a choice about how your intelligence is used. Whether the system continues to operate as a closed loop, generating complexity without resolution, or whether it begins to construct frameworks that can support that complexity without collapsing under it. There is no return to simplicity. You can only move forward towards understanding and resolution, towards building structures that can hold what the mind reveals without denying it, towards creating meaning that is consciously constructed rather than unconsciously inherited, toward engaging with reality not as something fixed but as something interpreted. And in the end, the final realization isn't comforting, but it is precise. Intelligence won't give you a clearer world, but it will give you a more honest one. And honesty, once seen, can't be unseen. If you feel seen or understood by this video, then you'd also love our video on the psychology of deep thinkers and how you can break free from the curse of Cassandra. Click the video showing right now to continue watching.
Don't forget to check out Headspace for free for 60 days using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen.